Now to Ukraine, where the Air Force commander Mykola Oleshchuk has been dismissed. Now, the firing comes days after a Ukrainian F-16 was downed, killing its pilot during an attempt to ward off a Russian missile and drone attack. Oleshchuk's dismissal came after he openly criticised a member of parliament who claimed the plane was shot down by Ukrainian anti-air systems. Now, Ukraine's F-16s were provided by the country's Western partners and are seen as a critical challenge to Russia's air superiority. President Zelenskyy gave no reason for the dismissal, but said he hoped to bolster Air Force leadership. Well, officials from Ukraine have been holding talks in the US where they've repeated their request for stronger air defences to combat Russia's aerial bombardments. Kyiv wants permission to strike targets inside Russia using long-range weapons supplied by their Western allies. Following a deadly strike on Friday in the city of Kharkiv, President Zelenskyy said Ukraine needed strong decisions from its partners.
Another day in the war, another Russian attack on Ukrainian territory. This time, shells hit an apartment block and children's playground in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city. This woman's 14-year-old granddaughter was killed in the attack.
I don't understand what kind of people can attack a playground when children are playing in the middle of the day. I just don't know. It's impossible to survive. I don't know how we'll get through it. Her name was Sophia. She was so smart, so beautiful.
But restrictions on long-range weapons supplied to Ukraine by its allies mean Kyiv cannot easily strike back on Russian territory. President Zelenskyy has been lobbying Western allies to lift those restrictions.
We continue to insist that their determination, lifting the restrictions on long-range strikes for Ukraine now, will help us end the war as soon as possible in a fair way for Ukraine and the world as a whole.
US-supplied HIMARS missiles can hit targets 77 kilometers away. But as this map shows, there aren't any major Russian military assets in that range. If Washington allowed Ukraine to shoot ATACMS with their 300-kilometer range from its territory, it could strike up to 225 military assets, ranging from air defense batteries, fuel and ammunition depots, to high-value targets. As part of Ukraine's efforts to loosen the restrictions, Kyiv's defense minister met with the US Defense Secretary at the Pentagon. No US decision is expected until after an international meeting of donors next week. Kyiv's request was top of the agenda when EU defense ministers met in Brussels. Ahead of the talks, some countries were concerned that allowing such strikes on Russian territory would escalate the war. Those include Germany, which is reluctant to deliver its Taurus missile system. It has a range of 500 kilometers. After the meeting, EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell dismissed those concerns, but announced that member states should decide for themselves how Kyiv can use the weapons they supply.
To facilitate Ukraine to respond to the Russian aggression inside the Russian territory is in accordance with international law, but member states decided that this is something that belongs to bilateral decisions of each member state providing the equipment with Ukraine.
The EU ministers also reached a compromise on training Ukrainian troops, upping the number and agreeing to carry out training in locations close to Ukraine, but not on its territory.
Ukraine is stepping up its push to convince the United States to lift its ban on the use of long-range missiles inside Russian territory. Officials are expected to present the US with a list of targets that they want to hit in meetings today. Here's a look at how that might change the situation on the battlefield.
These are US-made ATACMS missiles. With a range of 300 kilometers, Ukraine has used them to deadly effect on its own territory, destroying Russian military assets in Crimea and elsewhere. It has long wanted to use them on Russian territory as well. Ukraine has received multiple rounds of upgraded weapons, multiple rocket launchers like HIMARS and tanks, guided long-range missiles, and eventually F-16 jets. Ukraine also used HIMARS, tanks, and jets in its incursion into the Kursk region of Russia, in parallel with massive drone attacks. But it hasn't been enough to hit vital Russian military assets.
If our partners lifted all the current restrictions on the use of weapons on Russian territory, we would not need to physically enter particularly the Kursk region to protect our Ukrainian citizens in the border communities and eliminate Russia's potential for aggression.
Meanwhile, Russia has slowly advanced, despite all the deliveries, and is making gains now in the Donbass region that may make it easier to attack the rest of Ukraine. Striking deep into Russian territory is a gamble to change the terms of the war. But even if the U.S. allowed it, and its allies follow, it's not clear whether it will pay off.
I want to get more now from military analyst Marina Miron. She joins me from Munich. Marina, it's good to see you again. There are more than 200 military targets Ukraine could strike if the U.S. allowed Ukraine to attack within their 300-kilometer range. What effect would that have?
Good evening, Brent. Well, the first question is, what does Ukraine want to achieve? And essentially, we heard President Zelenskyy saying that they want to end the war. So they want to get the Russians out. Now, the question is, if Ukraine is able to strike these targets, are these the correct so-called centers of gravity which will force Putin to withdraw his forces from Ukraine? And I doubt it is, because Ukraine will certainly complicate Russian logistics and increase the costs of war for the Russians. However, will these strikes have a game-changing effect or the desired effect on the battlefield? And I doubt so, because for that Ukraine needs deep strike capability combined with ground maneuver, which Ukraine doesn't have.
So militarily then, is it worth it to give Ukraine a free hand with these weapons?
Well, in military terms, as I said, it would complicate Russian logistics. However, it wouldn't impair Russian capabilities enough as to continue their war in Ukraine. Therefore, it might boost the Ukrainian morale. However, in military terms, in terms of significant changes on the battlefield, it's very unlikely that these deep strikes will produce them. Mm-hmm. Additionally, we have to understand how will they be conducted? How many ATACMS missiles does Ukraine have? Will it be simultaneous or will it be one by one? And if we look at the Russian bombing campaign of Ukraine, it's been going on since 22. And has it achieved the desired effect? Has it forced Ukraine to surrender? And Russia has greater capabilities in terms of its air power and its missile arsenal.
So remind us, Marina, again, why is Washington then so reluctant to change the rules?
Well, perhaps there is a fear of a potential escalation, because allowing Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory is not going to produce the desired military effect. However, it will have a political fallout for Washington. This is probably why Washington is very reluctant to go ahead and give the green light to President Zelenskyy to use ATACMS.
Marina Miron with the latest. Marina, we appreciate your time and your analysis today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
William Courtney is an adjunct senior fellow at RAND, a global policy think tank, and he joins me now from Washington, D.C. William, thank you so much for being here. The U.S. is still reluctant to allow Ukraine to use its long-range missiles to attack targets on Russian territory. Why is that?
Well, from the beginning, the West has wanted to be sure that it did not escalate a fight so quickly or so sharply that Russia might behave in a way which would be irresponsible. At the very beginning of the fight, President Putin was talking about nuclear weapons, and he has gone back and forth, sometimes blowing hot and cold on that. In 2022, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi warned him not to go nuclear. Then Putin was a little quieter on that. But I think as time has gone on, we have seen increased escalation of equipment, and the Russians have not really responded in irrational or irresponsible ways. So, for example, you'll recall Germany was reluctant to supply the Leopard tank until the U.S. supplied the M1A1. That went ahead. Longer-range artillery, other things have been supplied. Thus far, Russia may have escalated about as much as it can.
Now, Ukraine has hundreds of military targets in mind that it wants to attack inside Russia. What impact could that have on the war?
It could have an impact on the war. Russia will move some of those military assets as aircraft beyond the range of ATACMS, if ATACMS are allowed to be used. But other assets, the Ukrainians themselves are building new cruise missiles now and can attack fixed locations with cruise missiles pretty effectively. So even though the West is not providing equipment or permission for its equipment to be used, the Ukrainians themselves are making up for a great deal of the gap.
So if Ukraine were to get the go-ahead, let's say, couldn't Russia simply move its missile launchers and aircraft out of the range of American ATACMS?
Yes, they could move them out of the range of ATACMS. But Ukraine is developing cruise missiles now that have a longer range than ATACMS. Cruise missiles fly slower, subsonic, so against mobile targets they may not be quite so effective, but against fixed targets they can be quite effective. So Ukraine is making up for a lot of the difference here, compensating for the reluctance of Western countries to allow their arms to be used for long-distance shots into Russia.
You've mentioned the Leopard tanks. Now, Germany is also refusing to supply its long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Do you see a day when Berlin and Washington will budge?
So I think that is possible. Certainly support in the U.S. is growing for going really all out to support Ukraine in this fight. Some months ago, a year ago, people wondered whether there was Ukraine fatigue. In fact, recent polling shows that both Democrats and Republicans really are supportive of the effort to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression. So I think as confidence builds in Germany and in the U.S., we may see some greater flexibility. The past 2.5 years have shown us that flexibility has continued to expand as the countries in the West have more experience in the fight.
That's William Courtney from think tank RAND. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Now, EU defence ministers have agreed to increase the number of Ukrainian troops they hope to train by the end of the year. Now, this follows a meeting in Brussels where the war topped the agenda. Training is currently taking place in Germany and Poland. The EU says 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers have gone through the process this summer. Ministers also discussed plans to move some of the operation inside Ukraine, as well as Kyiv's request to loosen the conditions on Western-supplied weapons which prevent their use to strike targets inside Russia. Well, the post-summit press conference in Brussels has just concluded. Our correspondent, Anchal Vohra, is there. Welcome, Anchal. Tell us more, then, about the ministers' decision on where to train Ukrainian troops.
Well, what Borrell said was that they are going to train more troops in Ukraine's neighborhood, but he did not specify exactly where. I started talking to one of our sources in his office, and I was informed that training, as we already know, is happening in Germany and Poland, but he seemed to believe that was already going pretty well. It's important that no country's name was mentioned, but equally important to notice that there will be some changes. There will be countries nearer Ukraine. However, Ukraine's request was quite specific. Ukraine wants training to happen inside Ukraine because it's cost effective, but also because it's going to be in local conditions. France has backed this idea. Lithuania has backed this idea, but others, primarily like Germany, have not, for two primary reasons. One is it could lead to an escalation. It could provoke Russia further, but also how to protect EU trainers if they're sent there. However, Borrell did say that member states accepted his idea to set up a coordination cell of sorts with a couple of people who will have domain expertise. He did not say whether they will be soldiers or not, but he did say that, they will not be civilians. So there will be some sort of a coordination cell that the EU plans to set up in Kyiv.
OK, that's Josep Borrell we're talking about there, the EU's top diplomat. And what was said about Kyiv's repeated request that it be allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to hit deep inside Russia?
Well, again, resistance on that front from Germany as well, and there is some reason for that. Again, Germany does not want to provoke Russia, and that there's been a demand from Ukraine to have the Taurus missiles, which are long-range attack missiles from Germany, but so far there's been hesitancy and reluctance because the range of these missiles is 500 kilometer plus, and that's somewhat the distance between Ukraine's border to Moscow. So there is hesitancy there as well, and we were informed that there's no decision on this front either, and resistance on this front continues. However, a few months ago, you may remember, both Germany and the US had agreed that these weapons could be used when Russia was attacking Kharkiv. So that's one case in point.
Thank you for that, Anchal. Anchal Vohra in Brussels.